Item 447. Structural bolting. 1. Description. Furnish and install high-strength bolts for structural connections. 2. Materials. 2.1 General. Use the same supplier for bolts and nuts to ensure proper fit. Have the manufacturer or distributor perform rotational capacity, RC, tests in accordance with TxDOT 452A on all bolt, nut, and washer assemblies. Test each combination of bolt production lot, nut lot, and washer lot as an assembly and assign an RC lot number to each lot tested. Test 2 samples from each assigned RC lot. Furnish a manufacturer's certified test report, MCTR, or a distributor's certified test report, DCTR, for each RC lot supplied. Include in the MCTR or DCTR results of the RC tests. RC lot number. Manufacturing location for assembly components. Date and location of tests, and a statement that the materials represented by the test report conform to the specifications. 2.2 Bolt assemblies. Provide bolts, nuts, and washers meeting the type, grade, and finish requirements in Table 1. Use ASTM A325 or A490 Type 3 plain, uncoated, bolts for weathering steel as indicated, and ASTM A325 Type 1 galvanized bolts for coated steel. Provide bolts long enough for the installed bolt end to be flush with or outside the face of the nut. Ensure galvanized nuts are lubricated with a lubricant containing a dye of a color that contrasts with the color of the galvanizing. Order ASTM A563 nuts with supplemental requirement S2 if they will be galvanized. Table 1. ASTM type, finish, and grade for structural bolts, nuts, and washers. See table in specifications. 1 ASTM A194 heavy hex grade 2H nuts may be substituted. 2.3 Washer type 1 indicating devices. Use compressible washer type direct tension indicators that meet ASTM F959 if allowed. Alternative washer type 1 indicating devices must be approved by engineer. Provide detailed testing, installation, and inspection requirements prepared by the manufacturer. 2.4 Storage. Protect all bolts and nuts from dirt and moisture at the job site. Remove from protected storage only those bolts and nuts anticipated to be installed during a workday. Return unused fasteners to protected storage at the end of the day. Do not clean fasteners of lubricant present in the as-delivered condition. Perform a field RC test at the contractor's expense in accordance with TxDOT 452A on any lot of fasteners that shows signs of rust, dirt, or loss of lubrication as directed. Apply additional lubrication and rear on the RC test before installing bolts if the fasteners fail the RC test. Replace any fasteners that cannot be relubricated to pass the field RC test. Tension control bolts may only be relubricated by the manufacturer. 2.5 Sampling and testing. Sample high-strength bolts, nuts, and washers in accordance with TxDOT 719. I perform field RC tests as directed in accordance with TxDOT 452A. Perform installation verification tests required in Section 447.4.1, Verification testing. 2.6 Fit-up bolts and erection pins. Provide heavy hex fit-up bolts of the same diameter as the connection bolts. Do not use washer type 1 indicating devices for fit-ups. Do not reuse galvanized bolts or ASTM A490 bolts that have been used as fit-up bolts. Provide a sufficient number of erection or drift pins, 1/32 inches larger than the bolt diameter. 2.7 Paint markers. Provide white or yellow paint markers for marking bolts or nuts for wrench calibration, RC tests, and bolt installation. 3. Equipment. 3.1 Testing equipment. Provide a calibrated tension measuring device, Skidmore Wilhelm or equivalent, calibrated torque wrench, and other accessories necessary to perform the installation verification test and the RC test and to calibrate hydraulic or electric torque wrenches. 3.2 Wrenches. Furnish either of the following types of wrenches. 3.2.1 Air-driven impact wrenches. Furnish air-driven impact wrenches, air compressors, and related accessories of sufficient capacity to properly tension high-strength bolts. Impact wrenches should be of sufficient size and capacity to be able to tension fully a bolt in less than 15 seconds. Repair or replace any wrenches that are unable to apply full tension to a bolt within this time. 3.2.2 Calibrated torque wrenches. Furnish calibrated hydraulic or electric torque wrench and related accessories capable of properly tensioning high-strength bolts. Calibrate the wrench to stall out or cut out completely when the bolt tension reaches 1.05 times the tension specified in Table 2. Calibrate the wrench by tensioning 3 bolts of each size in a calibrated tension measuring device, Skidmore Wilhelm or equivalent. Mark each bolt and verify the rotation from snug tight when calibrating the wrench as specified in section 447.4.5.3.1, turn of the nut method. Calibrate the wrench at least once each working day or as directed. Recalibrate the wrench for changes in bolt diameter, changes in bolt length greater than 2 bolt diameters, significant differences in the surface condition of the bolts, threads, nuts, or washers, or changes in the equipment or hose length. For construction. 4.1 Verification testing. Have each member of the bolting crew that will perform the actual work complete an acceptable pre-installation verification test in the presence of the engineer. Only crew members that have demonstrated proper workmanship via verification testing may perform production bolting work. 4.1.1 Air-driven impact wrench. Perform an installation verification test on 3 complete fastener assemblies of each combination of diameter, length, grade, and lot to be installed before beginning bolting. Follow the bolt tensioning procedures in section 447.4.5.3, tension bolts. Use a calibrated tension measuring device, Skidmore Wilhelm or equivalent, to verify and demonstrate that the method for estimating the snug tight condition and controlling the turns from snug tight develops a tension greater than 1.05 times the tension specified in Table 2. The snug tight condition is defined as the tightness that exists when the plies of the joint are in firm contact. 4.1.2 Calibrated torque wrench. Calibrate the wrench before beginning bolting in accordance with section 447.3.2.2. Calibrated torque wrenches. Use the bolting crew that will perform the actual work for the calibration and calibrate the wrench in the presence of the engineer. Follow the bolt tensioning procedures in section 447.4.5.3, tension bolts. 4.1.3 Direct tension indicator. Use a calibrated tension measuring device for compression type 1 indicators to verify the gap is not less than 0.015 inches or the job inspection gap specified by the manufacturer when tension in the bolt reaches 1.05 times the tension specified in Table 2. Follow the manufacturer's instructions for pre-installation verification testing methods and frequency for alternative washer type 1 indicating devices deemed acceptable. 4.2 Workmanship. The engineer will disqualify any crew members not adhering to proper installation methods during production work. Disqualified crew may not perform further bolting work until they complete an additional pre-installation verification test suitable to the engineer. 4.3 General. Ensure all material within the grip of the bolt is steel. Do not allow any compressible material such as gaskets or insulation within the grip. Ensure the slope of parts in contact with the bolt head or nut does not exceed 120 with respect to a plane normal to the bolt axis. Prepare all joint surfaces, including those in contact with the bolt heads, nuts, or washers, so that the surfaces are free of dirt, loose rust, loose mill scale, burrs, and other matter that would prevent solid seating of the parts. Replace any bolts and nuts installed for shipping purposes unless the shop drawings indicate the shop installed bolts are to be fully tensioned in the shop. Do not tension bolts that have been installed snug tight in the shop. Remove any bolts installed snug tight in the shop and replace them with new bolts. Inspect and prepare the joint surfaces after removing shop installed bolts that are not fully tensioned in the shop. Provide a hardened washer for heavy hex and tension control bolts under either the nut or the bolt head, whichever is turned during tensioning. Install hardened washers under both the nut and bolt head of ASTM A490 bolts when the outer plies being fastened have a yield strength less than 40 ksi. Install an ASTM F436 washer for direct tension indicators as follows. Under the nut when the nut is turned and the direct tension indicator is located under the bolt head. Between the nut and the direct tension indicator when the nut is turned and the direct tension indicator is located under the nut. Under the bolt head when the bolt head is turned and the direct tension indicator is located under the nut, and between the bolt head and the direct tension indicator when the bolt head is turned and the direct tension indicator is located under the bolt head. Tension all bolts to provide the minimum bolt tension values given in Table 2. Erect steel in conformance with Item 441, Steel Structures. Do not tack weld any parts to eliminate fit-up bolts or to hold parts together while bolting. Remove lubricant from bolt assemblies on painted structures after tensioning and before coating the connections. Retighten the nuts or tack weld the nuts to the bolts when bolts are used to temporarily support welded diaphragms after completing the welding operations if the diaphragms are over vehicular or pedestrian traffic. Table 2. Bolt tension. See table in specifications. 4.4 Preparation of faying surfaces. Perform blast cleaning or painting of faying surfaces in accordance with Item 441, Steel Structures. Provide an SSPC SP10 blast cleaning before shipment for weathering steel. Do not wire brush weathering steel faying surfaces. Roughen galvanized faying surfaces by hand wire brushing. Do not use power wire brushes to roughen galvanized faying surfaces. 4.5 Bolt installation. Use the following procedure for bolt installation of a complete connection. 4.5.1 Fair up holes. Use a minimum number of erection or drift pins, as directed, in the holes to fair up all holes. 4.5.2 Install bolts. Install bolts in all remaining holes of the connection. Do not use excessive force, which results in damage to the threads, to install the bolts. Increase the number of erection or drift pins as necessary to align the holes if force is required to install the bolts. Do not ream the holes unless approved. Ream the holes in accordance with Section 441.3.11.5, misfits, if approved. Remove the erection or drift pins and install bolts in these holes. Bring the connection to a full snug tight condition by snugging systematically from the most rigid part of the connection to the free edges. The snug tight condition is defined as the tightness that exists when the plies of the joint are in firm, full contact, and all of the bolts in the joint have been tightened sufficiently to prevent the removal of the nuts without the use of a wrench. A snug tight condition can usually be attained by a few impacts of an impact wrench or the full effort of a worker using an ordinary spud wrench as demonstrated in the installation verification test. As necessary, re-snug previously snugged bolts that may have relaxed as a result of the subsequent snugging of adjacent bolts to ensure all bolts are simultaneously snug tight and the connection plates are in full contact. Fully tighten a minimum number of bolts as directed until the plies are in full contact if snugging does not bring the plies of the joint into full contact. Mark these bolts as fit-up bolts. Use a non-galvanized ASTM A325 bolt of the same diameter as a fit-up bolt in connections requiring the use of galvanized ASTM A325 bolts. Re-snug all remaining bolts. Do not use washer type 1 indicating devices to bring the connection to a snug tight condition. Rather, install heavy hex bolt assemblies in a sufficient number of holes, approximately 20%, to attain firm, full contact between plies. Remove the heavy hex bolts and install the washer type 1 indicating device assemblies after firm contact is established by connections in surrounding bolt holes. 4.5.3 Tension bolts. Loosen all fit-up bolts after tensioning all the other bolts in the connection. Ungalvanized ASTM A325 bolts used as fit-up bolts may be reused in a connection using this type of bolt. Replace all galvanized bolts and ASTM A490 bolts used as fit-up bolts. Tension these remaining untensioned bolts in accordance with this paragraph. Ensure the element not turned by the wrench, bolt head or nut, does not rotate. 4.5.3.1 Turn of the nut method. Mark the nuts and the protruding bolt ends after the bolts have been brought up to snug tight condition and before final tensioning so that actual rotation can be determined. Tension all bolts in the connection to their final tension by the amount of rotation specified in Table 3. Start final tensioning at the center or most rigid part of the connection and progress toward the free edges. 4.5.3.2 Calibrated wrench method. Use a calibrated hydraulic torque wrench to tension all bolts to 1.05 times the tension given in Table 1 after they have been brought to the snug tight condition. Calibrate the wrench in accordance with Section 447.3.2.2, Calibrated torque wrenches. Start tensioning at the most rigid part of the connection and proceed to the free edges. Return the wrench to retension previously tensioned bolts that may have relaxed as a result of the subsequent tensioning of adjacent bolts. Place marks on the socket at 1/3 points so the amount of rotation can be visually determined. 4.5.3.3 Washer Type 1 Indicating Devices. 4.5.3.3.1 Compressible washer type direct tension indicators. Ensure the direct tension indicator arches are oriented away from the work and that they bear against the hardened bearing surface. Confirm the appropriate feeler gauge is 1, accepted in at least half the spaces between protrusions before tensioning, and 2, refused entry in at least half the spaces between protrusions after tensioning. 4.5.3.3.2 Alternative washer type 1 indicating devices. Follow the procedures prepared by the manufacturer and approved by the engineer. Verify proper installation after tensioning. 4.5.4 Bolt reuse. Do not reuse ASTM A490 or galvanized ASTM A325 bolts. Ungalvanized ASTM A325 bolts may be reused one time if the threads have not been damaged. Retensioning previously tensioned bolts loosened by the tensioning of adjacent bolts is not considered to be reuse. Tension all bolts in a connection within 10 days of installation. Bolts not tensioned within 10 days of installation are subject to field RC testing. Relubricate or replace any installed bolts that do not have sufficient lubrication as determined by the field RC test. Table 3. Nut rotation from snug tight condition. See table in specifications. 1 Nut rotation is relative regardless of the element, nut or bolt, being turned. The tolerance is 0 degree, plus 30 degree for bolts installed by January 2nd turn or less and 0 degree, plus 45 degree for bolts installed by February 3rd turn or more. 2 Determine the required rotation for bolt lengths greater than 12 diameters using the installation verification test in a simulated connection of solidly fitted steel. 5 Measurement and payment. Installation and testing of bolts will not be paid for directly but will be subsidiary to the pertinent items requiring the use of high-strength bolts. When payment for the structure associated with the bolts is made under Item 442, metal for structures, bolts, nuts, and washers will be paid for in accordance with Item 442, metal for structures.